Hey Ding Dongs, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
And this is Explain It to Jamie, the podcast in which I, Jamie, a politically innocent but curious young man, have the complicated political happenings of the world explained to me by my lovely friend, Richard Lamb.
A super intelligent Google algorithm given feelings.
Yeah, doesn't he sound real? Doesn't that voice make Google sound real?
Jamie, your contact lens prescription's almost out. You should order some more.
Oh, thanks, Google.
Also, your monthly billing to vibratorvixens.gov has bounced.
Fuck you, Google! I knew you were always out to get me. Just joking. Richard's not an algorithm.
I'm a human.
He's a real
for now.
human. Yes, he's
until all those cybernetics come in, and then I'm going to be mostly a toaster.
The great singularity Richard is looking forward to,
being the epicenter of it.
Yeah. We are doing Syrian refugee crisis.
That's
this
right.
week.
Jamie wants to know about Syrian refugees.
Yeah, what's going on with the Syrian refugees? Why they need places to stay?
Yeah. It's a good question.
Yeah.
What's going to happen to them?
Where are they going to go? How many of them are terrorists?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
6.
Yeah. Literally 6.
Literally 6.
And definitely at least one of them's Chad. Because that guy sucks.
Yeah, fucking Chad.
Fucking Chad. Chad, Syria. Don't like him, never have liked him.
Chad, Syria?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a fake name that a terrorist who doesn't know too much about the United States would name himself to throw off suspicion.
Yeah.
But to like allow a certain amount of suspicion, like believable suspicion.
Yeah.
On Chad.
Syria.
Yeah.
When you say Chad, like Syria, like that as a suffix, it makes it kind of sound like hysteria. So it's like you have Chadsteria. It's like you're so into Chads, which could either be the people named Chad or the country of Chad, or possibly the dangling bits left over when you punch a hole on a piece of paper.
Yeah, and only a 2-letter cousin of chode.
Jamie, your payment to chodesteria.co.uk has bounced.
Oh, God damn it, Google. I meant to type Chadsteria.
Okay, well, I apologize to Syrian refugees, and let's get into it!
That music always gets me hyped up to learn and to make jokes at the expense of my learning.
As it does to me.
Yeah.
Your super intelligent computer friend.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so Jamie, what do you know about the Syrian refugee crisis?
What do I know? I know actually a decent amount, I think. I think that, Syria is obviously in a massive, I don't know if you'd call it a civil war.
You would call it a civil war. Yeah.
Between ISIS, the fella who runs the show, the Totalian guy,
Bashir al-Assad.
That's what you would have called Mussolini back in 1930s.
Totalitarian?
Totalian.
It's Italian. Hey,
I'm not Italian.
Hey, I'm gonna kick you in the face with my boot, but the train is on time. I'm a 4'2".
So Bashir al-Assad.
Yes,
is the head honcho.
The government guy. Yeah.
There is the resistance, rebel fighters.
Yes.
And then ISIS is out in the desert.
That's right.
Waiting to see who loses.
And there's also the Kurds.
and also the Kurds, who we talked about in our ISIS episode.
Correct.
As pretty baller, a bunch of Middle Eastern fighters.
That's right. So there's a civil war in Syria.
Yeah.
And that's caused a lot of people to
need to leave Syria.
That's right. Yeah. So refugees as a concept came into existence after World War II. There were a lot of, obviously, refugees during World War II, people who were displaced by violent conflict from their homes, who tried to go other places because their homes were destroyed, they couldn't live there anymore, or they felt like they were in danger in their homes and tried to leave to get to safety, right? The classic example is like Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Once the Holocaust became widely known and understood, or even when Jews started to understand that the climate was really, was bad enough that it was time to go.
Right.
They tried to go other places, and in a lot of places, including in Canada, the governments were so anti-Semitic and suspicious of Jewish people that they just turned them away.
Right.
Like there's boatloads of Jewish people got to Canada across the ocean, and Canada turned them away and sent them back to Germany, where they died in concentration camps.
Now that's a semantic origin, right? Like that's when we first
like
started referring
refugees
to
have always existed, but it's like in the wake of people realizing they had sent all these people in need to their deaths. With the creation of the United Nations post World War II, refugees were, and during the Geneva Convention in, I think 1951 was the Geneva Convention, refugees were defined as a protected class of like international traveler, essentially, citizen, right? And the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was created to help give resources to those people's rights. So basically, once someone leaves their home country because they're in fear, they fear persecution, or they feel they're in physical danger in their home country, they count as a refugee. And if like you and I left Canada right now because we felt like we were in danger, and we got to another country, when we got there, we could say, we're fleeing Canada, we're declaring ourselves refugees, and we have to register as refugees. Then that country will check to see if we actually are refugees, right? And they'd probably look at our Facebooks and go, who are these two fucking assholes? And they'd send us home, right? But once you are officially counted as a refugee, suddenly you get the country that has you gets access to resources that are kind of pooled in the United Nations to help refugees, and you as a refugee have legal protections. You can't be deported back to your home country and stuff like that, right? It's also worth saying, if you go somewhere inside your own country because you're afraid of violence or persecution, so like if we went from Ontario to British Columbia, we don't count as refugees, and you don't get the same protections. Those people are referred to as internally displaced persons.
Okay.
One sec.
Wow.
There's a lot
the
of
computer has a virus.
Oh wow! I was gonna cut that, but now I have to leave it in because you made it.
I knew you were gonna cut it, and I thought, no.
How can I ruin this?
Cement that beautifully human moment into the internet history.
But isn't that what a super intelligent computer bent on destroying the world would want you to think?
You've been reading something Dreams of Electric Sheep, the book that Blade Runner is based on.
Yeah, that's right. The Philip K. Dick book.
Yeah.
I actually haven't read it, or have I?
Oh my god!
What kind of 12th dimensional chess is the computer playing?
Amazing!
I'm coughing again.
Yeah, I could see you.
So there's a lot of internally displaced people in Syria too, but there's also, I think the current estimate. Forgive me, I know my numbers are going to be a little bit foggy because I read a lot of articles that all come from different periods of time. So I'm trying to stay current on the freshest numbers. I might get some wrong.
No judgment on any foggy numbers, as any numbers you require me to produce will be made up.
Right. I believe there are 16 million total refugees right now registered on Earth, and about 12 million of those are Syrian refugees.
Whoa.
There's quite a lot of Syrian refugees.
You know, it's interesting because one of the things I wanted to talk about is sort of the term refugee, and about how, you know, I mean, this isn't just this doesn't just apply to this particular situation, but because I've heard the word refugee thrown around so many hundreds of times in the last year, now whenever someone says the word refugee, my brain just automatically equates it with Syrian refugees.
Yes.
You know, like now that's what that word means for me.
Well, we're in a flashpoint, right? Like there are always refugees, and there have been more than one refugee crisis since refugees as a protected class were created. Like after the Vietnam War, there was a massive refugee crisis. And the United States settled hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people who were fleeing South Vietnam after the fall of, oh my God, Saigon. Right? Like, I wanted to call it Ho Chi Minh City, which obviously is now what it's called because the communists won.
Yeah.
But after the fall of Saigon and the kind of defeat of the United States, a lot of collaborators and stuff fled, so they got resettled in America. Also, a lot of Vietnamese boat people, they were called, got settled in Canada as well.
Yes, and actually, I'm gonna start things off with a very interesting anecdote of when I was a young kid. I had this great aunt, and she was sort of the mortar in our extended family, right? Like, she was the one responsible for always making sure, like, not just cousins hung out, but like you met your second cousins and, you know, distant relatives. And every few years she'd hold a family reunion, and one year she held it, and me and my cousins went, and my aunts and uncles and parents, and it was this picnic that was like full of people that obviously we'd never met, but it was overwhelmingly Vietnamese,
Right?
like 70% Vietnamese people of like 200 people,
Right.
in a family reunion that I was at.
For a bunch of white Irish people.
Yeah, so I was like, we sort of showed up instantly confused, like instantly like, wait, are we Vietnamese? You know, and that makes sense. I had
you were like, I gotta call my agent.
yeah, right.
I gotta change my ethnicity on my resume.
Yeah, well, when I was younger, I had thinner eyes, and I always had really dark eyelashes. So actually, occasionally people would say, like, "Are you like half Asian?"
Yeah.
I obviously could not pass as that now.
No.
but so I was like, yeah, a lot of things were confirmed for me in that moment. As it turns out, my great uncle helped
settle a refugee family.
Settle a number of refugee families,
okay.
and so they are like technically part of the family.
Yes.
But obviously have no genetic link.
That's right. And that's a super interesting thing about Canada that we'll talk about shortly, I'm sure. Canada's one of the only countries on earth that actually allows people to do that. Private citizens to bring refugees into the country.
Right.
But the reason that you've equated refugee with Syrian refugee is because since 2011, when the Syrian civil war started, the Syrian civil war has been such a violent and bloody conflict. Oh, should I pause? Oh, good idea.
Sorry, I should have waited for the end of your point.
It's fine.
I was closing the window. If this gets cut, it gets cut. If it doesn't, hey.
Did Jamie close the window, or did I delete the outside world?
Yeah.
Is this even Jamie and Richard, or is it all a simulation?
Oh man, can you imagine if I found out you never existed? If you were just like a part of my consciousness manifesting itself in real space for me? Has anyone ever seen us talking? That's why everyone looks at me the way I do when I talk about you. Richard, I knew it. I'm just
gonna let you angle. I'm just gonna let you keep improvising. Keep ripping. Okay, back to Syrian refugees.
Back to Syrian refugees.
Yeah, so it's been such a bloody and violent conflict. It has radically spiked the number of refugees who are trying to seek safety. And it's caused an international crisis, essentially, because okay, well, in the West, we have a weird perception of the refugee crisis. You know, in Canada, it's a super hot topic politically right now. It's pretty high profile, right? And in the United States, like refugees coming from Syria occupy a large space in the national mindset, whether that's justified or not, right? And to give some numbers here, like Barack Obama pledged to settle 10,000 Syrian refugees in the United States, which caused an uproar among many people. And you know, Donald Trump's ban on banned all refugees coming into the country with his first travel ban, and Syria was one of the targeted countries in that ban, and that was a measure that was designed to make him popular with the people who were his base who didn't want refugees coming in, right? Similarly, Canada has settled a lot more refugees than the United States, but we've only settled about 40,000 Syrian refugees so far as of right now.
I was going to say 10,000, that's pretty piddly, isn't it?
10,000's nothing.
Yeah.
But like what happens when the refugee crisis is a crisis because you can think of it like a rock thrown into a pond, and there's like an impact point, and the impact point would be Syria, and then there's like ripples, right? And the ripples first affect of people leaving the country first affect the countries that border Syria, right? So Canada's taken on 40,000 Syrian refugees, which seems like a large number, and there's a lot of people who think we're being too generous in Canada. But like Turkey has taken 3 million Syrian refugees.
Holy.
Right? And Lebanon, right now, almost 20% of the people in Lebanon are Syrian refugees.
Whoa.
Like 1 in 5 people almost. I think 1 in 6 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. So in those countries, there is a crisis.
Right.
Like 3 million people crossing the border into your country to seek safety is a crisis.
That's huge.
And it's just a logistical crisis. Like, where are those people going to eat and shit? That's a crisis immediately.
It's like the province of Alberta.
Yeah.
Walking into
Manitoba or something.
Yeah.
You know, like that's a crisis. Where do they live? What do they do?
Yeah.
You know? And that's why, rippling outwards then, you know, quickly, Turkey, people seeking safety in Turkey, which is it's also kind of an authoritarian country, but it's pretty modern. It was overwhelmed. And the conditions for living in Turkey rapidly deteriorated. Turkey also was not that safe. Like, there's ISIS penetration into Turkey. It's not always, and Turkish people became kind of unfriendly to Syrian refugees as their society became overwhelmed with them. So Syrian refugees started trying to get into Europe, and that's where shit really has gotten crazy, right?
Right.
It's again interesting from our perspective in Canada. We get a really humanitarian kind of like, you know, profile in the New York Times sort of look at the Syrian refugee crisis about the people who are arriving in Canada. But Canada has the privilege of the Atlantic Ocean and has the privilege of choosing who gets to come and be resettled in Canada, right? Like refugees who come to Canada are super heavily vetted. You can't just get to Canada if you're a Syrian refugee, right?
Right.
Whereas what they're doing increasingly now is piling onto these really flimsy rafts, right? And trying to leave either from Turkey or from Syria or from Lebanon, whatever countries they're in, and cross the Mediterranean and land somewhere in Europe. And overwhelmingly, they land in Greece, right, which we've talked about in our last episode, is an extremely poor country right now, whose social safety net and whose like welfare systems are being devastated by the austerity being forced on them by the European Union because of the Eurozone crisis, right? Like Greece has boatloads of people showing up on the shore. You know, they're literally today, a boat washed up on the Greek shore that had a 4-day-old baby.
Whoa.
And what do you do? Like, you throw these people back in the water? Like, you can't send them back once you get them, right?
Everybody except the baby.
Essentially, everybody puts up.
Yeah. We'll be taking that off your go.
Yeah.
May I suggest West?
Yeah. Well, and so basically the crisis arose as the countries that were kind of on the border, which include Hungary and Greece and some of the Balkan states and stuff like that, didn't want people to just pour through them, right? They wanted essentially... they all have different reactions. Greece has been a lot more forgiving. They don't have the resources to handle everybody, but they're like, generally there's a lot of empathy in Greece, right? Whereas in Hungary, which is a closed ethnic state, right? Like Hungarians live in Hungary, and there's some Hungarians in neighboring states, but it's a very small country. It's not very rich, and it's kind of xenophobic because it's surrounded by a lot of larger cultures that have many times over history threatened to destroy it and has only persisted out of strength of will. Right. I mean, I'm not whitewashing it. There's a lot of horrible, very, very prejudiced things about Hungarian culture, including really bad anti-Semitism and also, you know, pretty bad anti-refugee sentiment. But Hungary's building fences now. Like, you know, there was an infamous video a while ago of Hungarian, like that kind of like symbolized how much Hungarians hate the refugees. Is there were these refugees running because the Hungarian police was taking apart their camp and arresting people, and so they were running trying to get farther into Hungary, and there was a journalist with a camera tripping refugees.
Oh yeah, I
remember that? Yeah, so that's like an example of how different countries are handling different. Now, maybe
do you think that Hungary would be satiated if they all had O. Henrys?
This is one of those my soul has died moments. Don't say it. Don't complete the jingle.
Oh, Hungary. Oh, Henry.
Woo! Well, let's send that to the European Union. We'll see what they do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is another interesting thing. Remember, the European Union is an economic an economic arrangement, but not a political union, right?
Right.
So there's no European policy about refugees. They're trying to agree on who's going to take how many of what, but all of the states have control over their own immigration, right? The European Union can't be like, everyone take this much shit. Now, Angela Merkel is trying to do that, and she has tried to be a leader and lead by example. Germany has settled over 1 million of the refugees, which is a lot.
Right.
Now, again...
Maybe, I forgot to mention that in our last week's episode, Angela Merkel. If you feel like going to check that out, please do. But I forgot to mention... I think that's where a lot of my sort of predisposed admiration for her before we did that episode came from. Was because I knew Germany was settling
a lot of refugees. And she faced a lot of political heat for it. And it's actually gotten better now. Germany started to settle fewer refugees, partly because I think there are fewer refugees coming now because a lot of them have just fled already or died, which is horrible to say, but true. So I think German people are starting to chill out a little bit about it.
Right.
But again, she faced a lot of political heat about that. But then there are countries like Sweden. Sweden is a very generous refugee state and has tried to settle a lot of refugees, but it's been very draining on them and really draining on their economy, and their tolerance for it is starting to wane. But then there's also states like Denmark, which is a super hostile refugee state. And actually the Danish parliament passed a law that if refugees show up there, in order to help pay for them, the Danish government will take all their shit. And confiscate their belongings and their valuables and stuff.
I saw a little mini documentary. I can't remember if it was Denmark or Sweden. Which, like, if you're from Denmark or Sweden, I'm sorry. But one of them, but I think it might have been Sweden. Whichever one it was, they have a very far right party that's gaining more and more.
Denmark
prominence.
has that. So does Finland. It could be either of those countries.
It might have been Denmark.
Yeah.
Anyway, but in this documentary, they were saying, like, this isn't even, was it refugees? But they're having, like, little Muslim ghettos. That actually has been happening in Sweden too in some places, and Sweden's getting a lot of refugees from Somalia, and apparently they're having some trouble with like gang related violence. But okay, like here's a myth I want to get into right away. The refugees coming to Canada are generally like settled families. They're like full families, right? It's like parents and children. That's what the preference that the Canadian government has for selecting refugees. So we have a super different integration experience than the Europeans do, where anyone can just show up in Europe because they're attached by land, right? Or it's easier to physically get there, whereas in Canada you can only get here if we allow you to. Right.
And then B, a lot of the refugees are single young men, right? Which is psychologically a different thing for the European countries, like in many ways because of racism and prejudice. But then also, like refugees are, in order to settle them, they're often held in refugee camps, which are like temporary shelters built either by the government or by the United Nations that just give them somewhere to sleep and like basic access to services like just water and some food, right? Like just the most bare necessities of life. Usually people are crammed into tiny conditions and not given very much, but they're given at least enough to not just die on the street.
Yeah.
But those conditions, in many of the countries they arrive in, they can't work right away, so they have a lot of trouble getting money. In a lot of places, they have to make their kids work, or they have to pay for their kids to go to school, which they can't afford, so kids stay out of school. People are kind of sitting around with absolutely no money, not doing anything, and those are the conditions that cause violence, drug abuse, and kind of like criminal activity among any group of people in the world.
Right.
If you shove a bunch of people in a very small area of space and give them absolutely no resources or money, generally crime happens. Right. That's like a pretty universal rule. So I would say it has nothing to do with the inherent character of the Syrians, that there's poverty and crime and things like that among some areas of the refugee resettlement in Europe. It's just that these are bad conditions they're going into, and it's hard to integrate them softly into society, right? It's because it's such an aggressive and fast change that needs to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. Okay. So how many Syrian refugees has Canada agreed to take? 40,000?
At this moment, we have 40,000.
Okay.
Yeah. And okay, well, yeah, and so this is an interesting thing too. About 2/3 of the refugees taken in by Canada are brought in by the Canadian government, and the Canadian government pays them, provides for their housing and food, and gives them kind of an income for 1 year. But the rest, kind of like about 40% of the refugees brought in, are privately sponsored, which is a thing that you can do in Canada that you can't do in a lot of other places, but that a lot of other places have started talking about, which is where any group of private citizens can agree to sponsor a refugee. You come together, you have to raise a certain amount of money, which is about what the government would pay them in a year. I think they say it's $27,000 like the minimum. So
hashtag UBI.
Hashtag UBI, baby. So you need once you raise enough money to support a family for a year, you're kind of, you tell the government, okay, our group has raised it, and they literally go, there's a family coming on this day. Do you want them or not? Right. And you have to say yes or no. You know almost nothing about them. You can't pick or choose. It's not like the pet store, right? You can't just adopt one. And then your group of people is responsible for giving them the money, giving them an income that you've raised, and then kind of like being their social support network. Like you're kind of their ambassadors into Canadian culture and into the new place that they're living. And this is considered quite a successful program in a lot of ways. Obviously, the individual experiences range greatly. There's as many different stories of it as there are human beings involved in it, right? Everyone has a different experience. But generally speaking, there's a much higher success rate with integration in terms of like people manage to find jobs, people manage to become self-sufficient and things like that. It's a lot easier if you have a privately sponsored refugee than a government-sponsored refugee. That being said, the government tends to want to support harder cases, right? So people who, like, one of the major problems with Syrian refugees is a lot of the people who are coming from Syria are illiterate in Arabic. They're from rural populations, and they never learn to read. They're farmers or whatever. It's just not part of their culture. And when someone's illiterate in their own language, it's really hard to teach them another language. Way harder than if they're literate, right? Because you can write it down. You imagine trying to teach someone a language, but you can't write anything down.
Right.
You can't use a translation app to show them
what
Google Translate,
say,
right? Like stuff like that. So it becomes a world more difficult, and the government takes responsibility for harder cases like that and prefers to give more educated, more literate people with more English who are economically better, who have more skills, to the private groups. Okay. So that's kind of part of what skews the numbers.
Right. So let's, as we often do, point our peepers towards the south and our good pal,
right,
Donald Chestnut Trump.
Yeah.
So he, because there was that story a number of weeks/months ago about him talking to the Australian Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Re some refugees that Barack Obama had agreed to take from Australia.
Right.
Trump is saying no, we're not going to take them.
Right.
Are they going to take them? And also, is the U.S.'s policy on refugees changing based on, I know the travel ban was just sort of was just kiboshed. But,
well, I think that Donald Trump is extremely easily influenced and has only the most simplistic understanding of a given issue at any moment. And I think that certainly the people around him don't want Syrian refugees, and certainly it's really easy politically for him to rail on Syrian refugees, and it's easy for him to play into the fear that Syrian refugees are degenerate rapists and murderers who are all working for ISIS, right? That's the kind of the stereotype that we're at risk of. Now, I'm going to take a moment to say there have been some really shitty things that have happened committed by Syrian refugees in Europe. It's a bad situation. It's not a fun situation. The most infamous is on New Year's Eve in 2014. There was like a mass sexual assault in Cologne, Germany, right? You probably heard about this when it happened. It was big news. Like hundreds of men were like groping and assaulting women at the big train station in Cologne, Germany, and a lot of them were North African or they were refugees. Like I don't remember that. Anyway, this happened, and this is often used as a right-wing point they've scored against having refugees. Now, it's also worth saying that there's lots of copycat kind of incidents reported, and a lot of them have been fake. A lot of people are lying about these kinds of things happening also in Europe. There's lots of instances of people saying a mass sexual assault was committed by refugees, and the cops are like, we can't find any evidence at all of this happening. That's happened several times since this Cologne, Germany one, right? So that's happened. A popular one that people talk about in Canada is a Syrian refugee was arrested at the West Edmonton Mall water park for groping 6 women.
Whoa.
That happened. It's shitty. I will say that as far as I know, that's the only Syrian refugee in Canada who has been arrested for a sexual assault, and that makes he's 1 out of 40,000, which makes that rate about like 2.5 out of 100,000 sexual assault people, and the rate for Canadians is like 57 out of 100,000. So you're 1/60th is 1/30th is likely to get assaulted by a Syrian refugee by a Canadian.
Take that, Syrian refugees.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got a lot to learn.
Step up your game, guys.
Do you have any idea how hard it is to teach someone sexual assault when they can't read their own language?
You should see the pictures I've had to draw. It's not pretty, let me tell you. Yeah. Oh, what a horrible line of joking.
Horrible line of joking, but also we joke so we don't cry.
Yes, we do. Anyway,
I don't know. I think
those things happened, certainly. But
I would be much more suspicious if it was. I don't like clean arguments. Like I don't like an argument that's like this is right because of 100% stat. I think no, if it's not dirty, it's not true.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's true that probably that some of the terrorist attacks that were committed in Europe, like the Paris shootings or the Berlin truck attack, some of those people may have gotten into Europe in groups of refugees. Sure. There's 12 million displaced people, and this is this is a crisis. That's a good word for it. Nobody's having a good time here. Nobody thinks this is ideal, and nobody thinks this is there's nobody's plan A happening right now. But what we're saying is this is a serious moral imperative that we have to help these people, right? Like to do nothing and let these people suffer and die. We did that in World War II, and I think it haunts us. Certainly anyone who learned, when I read about for the first time Canada turning away Jews who died and who made it to Canada from Germany and then were sent back to Germany by Canada to die in concentration camps, never again. Right. Never again.
Well, here's an idea. What if we took the bottom half of Alberta and the top half of Montana, hollowed it out, and we put all the Syrian refugees there and made a new country?
Yeah.
How would that pan out?
We call it Beefistan. Yeah. Honestly, though, okay,
I was trying to make a joke about the invention of Israel, but I don't really understand.
I see. You didn't know enough about it?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay, well,
that's basically what happened, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sort of.
More or less. Let's make a note right now that we're definitely going to get that down in a future episode.
I've written that down. I am eating the piece of paper, and now I
and
never
that's
forget.
Part of you. Yeah. Okay, so let's transition now into this part of the episode.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so
I like your tone. This sounds like a promising, hopeful bit.
What we're going to see in the future.
Yeah.
And this is the tip of a huge iceberg. The Syrian refugee crisis is the tip of what's going to become an absolutely mind-bogglingly gigantic global refugee crisis within our lifetimes. We're going to see heavy populations of people who come from large Muslim countries fleeing into the West and having to settle here. People are worried that Syrians won't integrate well, that they'll be resistant to Western culture. Obviously, every Syrian person has a different attitude to it. I've heard stories of Syrians totally being down to just be in Western culture. I've heard, in Syria, their wives wore hijabs, and here they're like, you know what, you don't need to. It's a cultural thing. It's not religious doctrine for them. Right. I've heard of other people who said, I'm uncomfortable with my daughters doing these things, but we're in a new country now, so I have to respect that. And then I've heard of people trying to make their kids still be Syrian. I've heard the whole spectrum of stories. The honest and uncomfortable truth that the West is going to have to face is that we're going to have huge Muslim populations immigrating into our countries because of need and desperation and devastation, and we are going to adopt them, and they're going to have to adopt to a fundamentally different culture, but their culture is going to influence us as well. They're going to become numerically large and significant political populations in some parts of the countries. And perhaps those countries will start to see more like political priorities that are more in line with people who come from Islamic countries. That might happen.
Right.
Here's the story. Put your soul protective goggles on right now, because this is going to get pretty intense.
Okay, all strapped in.
The country of Bangladesh is it borders India and Pakistan and Burma. It's so it's on the Indian Ocean, right, in Asia, and Bangladesh is mostly lowland, so it's basically at sea level, right, and it's a country of 150 million people. And there's a very good chance that because of global warming, by the time our kids are old, 80% of it will be underwater. And 150 million people are going to have to find new homes.
Whoa.
And those are Muslim people.
Yeah.
Right? Who are all going to have to flee somewhere. And I'm talking about there's a lot of small islands off of the coast of Bangladesh. They're already half gone in the last 15 years.
Wow.
I'm talking like people have visited those islands and people are like, 20 years ago, that was my house. And there's like a tree 400 feet out of the water.
Whoa.
Right? Global warming is causing the Himalayan mountains to melt more every year, which is causing the flood waters coming in from the mountains through Bangladesh to the ocean to be huger and huger and wider. It's eroding the kind of very fertile soil of the riverbanks. More feet every year are disappearing into the rivers as the water gets bigger and bigger. It's also forcing, the sea levels are rising, so it's forcing salt into the soil of Bangladesh, so their crops are dying.
So
They're
the
starting
crops
to
don't grow.
Those crops aren't growing. Their country is physically disappearing into the ocean to the point where Bangladesh's best and brightest scientists and thinkers are already creating massive floating boat complexes that are part school, part hospital. Like they're like these boat refugee cities.
They're getting ready for Waterworld.
They're getting ready for Waterworld, and it's not a joke.
God.
Think of how big a global issue the Syrian refugee crisis is.
Yeah.
12 million people.
Multiply that by 10.
150 million Bangladeshis will need a new home. There's a good chance within the next 50 to 60 years, right?
Wow.
So what in researching this, I've come to realize, like, we need to, create a good refugee resettlement infrastructure. We need to get good at resettling refugees because we're going to need to.
Yeah,
do it a lot, especially a country like Canada that has space for people. Right. And maybe we don't have the most resources, but we have the room. Like Germany, Germany, the most populous nation in the EU, which is not huge, like geographically, and which already has taken 3 million Syrians, can't take a lot more people. Right? There's not a lot of countries that can take all these people. India is already building a wall on the border with Bangladesh to keep people from running across the border into India. Like, that's where, this isn't a maybe.
Right.
This is gonna happen. These people are gonna need a new place to live. And we're gonna start seeing that with probably a lot of island nations. And these are the people who are gonna be the most vulnerable to climate change. And not to like totally ruin your day here, but that's the 50 to 60 years number is the like definitely number. If a huge ice shelf breaks off and melts into the ocean randomly, it'll happen like tomorrow, very fast.
Wow.
Yeah, and then it'll be millions of dead people and millions of people looking for new homes, and we have to be ready for this. It's going to happen.
Wow.
This is why the Syrian refugee crisis, it's a moral crisis. It's like, do we let these people die while we still have all of these resources and space? Or do we let them in? Right?
But it's also a real test.
It's a test too, and it's an opportunity. Yeah. It's an opportunity for us to get ready for what is sure to be an extremely serious refugee crisis in the next 100 years. Right. I can't go without saying too that Bangladesh is sinking because of global warming. It wasn't sinking before man-made global warming in the 18th century. The 19th century began with the Industrial Revolution, and the West, Canadians, Americans, Europeans, are the beneficiaries of global warming. Like, the boats are bringing shit to us. You know
Right.
what I mean? Like the cars, the trucks, like we're the ones who are getting a lot out of global warming, and the people who are gonna have their country sink into the ocean are the ones who are paying the price
Right.
first, right? So I think
Right.
that's a huge part of why morally we need to be ready to help these people, because we are as responsible as anybody. We are responsible for this happening.
Well, wow. We should do an episode on global warming.
Yeah,
also.
okay.
That's a good one. Climate
I'd be
change,
happy
global
to do
warming.
it. I mean, not happy. I'd
Holy
be super depressed to do
hell.
it. But like
150 million.
150 million people.
That's 5 times Canada's population.
It's 150 million people who live in a country the size of Iowa. It's a super dense country. Yeah.
Holy shit.
And it's all at sea level. And it's sinking.
Oh, Bangladesh be sinking.
Bangladesh be sinking.
Wow, and that's just like, and that's also just one example of a need for mass refugee help.
I mean,
of which I'm sure we're like, that's not going to be the sole
No,
reason for refugees.
Wars
in the next
cause
50
refugees.
years.
Wars cause refugees, and natural disasters cause refugees. And as climate change increases, we're going to see more crazy weather events. Like
Right.
typhoons have gotten way harder in Bangladesh than they ever have. Right? There used to be a really serious typhoon every couple of years. Now there's like 4 a year.
Whoa.
Like huge, where like massive waves come crashing in and carry away entire houses and shit like that. That's been happening more and more, and that kind of thing will happen across the world. Even the Syrian civil war has been attributed to climate change, actually, in a lot of ways, because there was a really bad drought for 3 or 4 years before the Syrian civil war started, which meant a lot of farms failed, and a lot of rural people had to resettle into cities. There was a big migration of people from the country into cities where they lived generally in poverty. Social conditions got really bad. The social safety net was really strained, and the kind of unrest and anger about that was what helped spark the Civil War. You can't solely attribute it to that, but it was a contributing factor for sure.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And at the end of the day, like, and okay, so that's the big picture.
Yeah.
Let's just zoom back in though. The experience of being like, this is going to sound glib, but I actually found this weirdly helpful. Like, think of those days when you're traveling and it's like a 12-hour day and you've been in the airport and on planes and shit for fucking hours.
Yeah.
And how uncomfortable 12 hours in transit will make
Right.
you, right?
Instead of like
Oh,
6 months.
And then combine that with, like, think of the feeling when you're about to move and all your shit is in boxes and you don't have any of your things.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have access to it. Like, you don't feel like you exist anywhere.
Yeah.
Like those those feelings times a million
Yeah.
are the experience of being, plus the threat of physical harm, the terror that your family might
don't
be
send
killed.
me back to where I came
Exactly,
from.
but like just the spiritual feeling of being uprooted. Like these people are just looking for a home.
Right.
They're people who have given up on their home. You'd only become a refugee. Like there is a chance a lot of refugees end up returning to their home country once things have stabilized. Who knows when Syria is going to stabilize? It's
Right.
not clear what's going to happen there.
Right. By then, I'm sure that 4-day-old baby will be certainly grown into a person with a personality.
There are kids, it takes years to get approved to come to the West, certainly to Canada as a refugee. There are kids, 8-year-old kids who are coming now, who are Syrian refugees, who haven't been in school in like 5 years.
Wow.
Right? So you were like 3 years old,
Right.
and you haven't been to a school and you're 8, that's it's a crisis. It's a generational crisis.
Right. So we talked a bit about internally displaced people and also like refugee status and stuff like that. Now I was reading a number of weeks ago about about Muslim people in the U.S. Trying to jump the border into Canada.
Yes.
When I think
After the Trump
catalyst was the Trump election.
That's right.
And they're not refugees.
Right.
They're, like, according to the UN, they are displaced or something.
No. Well,
scared to
they
shit.
could be refugees. Canada has this thing called the Safe Third Country Agreement. And what that means is if you are a refugee and you get to a place that's considered a safe country and then you try to come to Canada, you don't count as a refugee in Canada. So if you're Syrian, you get to the U.S. and then you try to come to the U.S. from the U.S. to Canada, you can't get counted. You can't be like, I'm a refugee. They're like, you already got to safety, basically, is what they're saying. There's a loophole.
Right, we got you out. You don't get to be picky and choosy.
Yeah, so because of that, Canada can deport refugees who try to do that. But there is a loophole where if you're picked up in an undocumented border crossing or something like that, you can still claim refugee status. And also there's like, even if you end up getting deported, once you declare yourself a refugee, like if you're crossing the border, you declare yourself a refugee, they have to look into it before they can say you are or you aren't. And that's a period of several months, like minimum, where they'll take care of you. Right. So if you need temporary safety, it's an option. It's not an attractive option, but a lot of people are hedging their bets on it as opposed to being, deported from the U.S.
Yeah, well, I was curious about that for a couple reasons. Like one, it's a very like real, tangible example of like the fear that Trump creates in his own country. You go, oh wow, these people actually like went to up and leave. Yeah. Another part of me is like, I don't know.
And it's worth saying.
Is it as crazy as they're anticipating it to be?
Here's an interesting number. Like usually there's about in Manitoba, there's a border crossing in Manitoba that's quite easy to cross on foot. It's the middle of winter, right? So it sucks. Yeah. But it's like one of the easier ones to just walk across the border because there's nothing there. And generally they get about, I think the number is 30 to 40 spontaneous border crossings. That's the air quotes term for it or whatever, a year. Yeah. And it's now March and they've had 400. Whoa. 400 people crossing from the US to Canada. Often it's like 8 hours through a field in the middle of night in winter in like knee deep, waist deep snow. People have lost like toes and fingers and stuff to frostbite trying to cross from the US into Canada. This is not fucking around. Right. This is not a walk in the park. This is a serious thing. Yeah. It also costs generally people pay thousands of dollars to get a guide to bring them close to the border. You have to pay for it's this tiny town in Manitoba that's processing all these people.
Right. This is more of a jolly little anecdote about crossing the border. But my uncle lives in Tsawwassen, BC. Mm-hmm. He used to ride his bike across the border somewhere down there, but not at a checkpoint. He would just
take it across.
Find a trail, ride his bike across the border, and he'd go buy beer in the States because it's a bit cheaper. And so he went and did that and had a backpack full of beer and rode his bike across. And it was like the next day or like 2 days later, and for the next couple weeks, there were signs up like all over Tsawwassen and other neighboring towns being like, red alert, be on the lookout for a man was seen riding his bike across the border. We don't know who he is, we don't know what he's about. And my uncle knew. It was me. It was me.
He just wanted some Miller Lite.
For cheap.
It was Miller time, and when it's Miller time,
he wanted to save $8.
Yeah. Like you do. People cross legally at the border to like buy gas and stuff. Mm-hmm. It used to not be that big a deal, although I think most people wouldn't do that anymore.
No,
it's been a pretty heinous situation here. I'm not sure how international this news has gotten. Obviously, any Canadians listening would be pretty familiar with this, but Canadian people who generally enjoy pretty free movement across the border into the United States have been getting hassled and sent away for really bizarre and arbitrary reasons under Trump in a way that's it's actually kind of alarming how quickly the temperature changed. Yeah. And that's real, right? Like the same, I guess you wouldn't be crazy to think the tide was turning against you. I mean, ICE, which is like the U.S. immigration agency, the people who will arrest you and deport you, they've been doing lots of raids. They've been deporting people.
Should they have picked less of a supervillain name?
I know. I thought they used to be called the INS, but I think they changed their name to ICE.
Right. Like it's a bit too cool.
It could have been like it should have been like Black Ice. Yeah. You never see it coming, but it'll get you.
It'll get you.
Yeah.
Don't you think about it?
And they've been doing horrifying things like arresting people who are getting medical operations, like who are like in the hospital, or like arresting people who are appearing in court because their spouse was beating them,
Right.
and they arrested a woman like at her own domestic abuse trial, and deported her.
Well, that'll teach her. Right?
Ooh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeff Sessions? Have you found your way back in the closet?
Oh, hey, boy. I just heard you talking about refugees, and I thought I'd chime in.
Go on.
Fuck refugees.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Sessions.
Well, bye, Mr. Sessions. I don't work for the government, obviously, but if I did, I would be very careful
About naming
to choose a department in which, like,
Yeah.
at the Nuremberg trials,
Yeah.
didn't sound so obvious.
Yeah, right. It's like,
you know what I mean?
It's like, listen, we at the Agency of Mexican Skulls and Tears have never ever engaged in any wrongdoing with the parts of the Mexican people. I wonder how many other like hilarious government names there are. Like, one of my favorite ones in Canada is Canada's like the Canadian Army's like Navy SEALs, like they're like elite special operations unit. You know this probably. It's called Joint Task Force 2, JTF2.
JTF2, yeah.
Here's some, but nobody knows if there's a JTF1.
Whoa.
Like, no one's ever. It's like totally. It would seem to make sense that there would be a JTF1, but no one knows. No civilians know what it is, what its deal is, what it does exactly. Like, nobody has any idea about that.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
There should be a TV show about that.
But you think, like, they're like, yeah, it's JTF2. There are elite special. They're like, so there are elite special forces units. And people are like, oh, so if they're 2, then what's 1? They're like, shit, we can't tell them about the pigeon, the pigeon soldiers. Shit,
Yeah.
Why didn't we call the human soldiers JTF1 and make the pigeon soldiers JTF2 so that we didn't clue in that there was a secret unit of pigeons?
It's like that classic. I don't know if this is classic, but it's the old. It's an old like prank, like high school prank that my dad told me about. I don't know if he did it or if it was just like urban legend. But you go get 3 pigs from the farm, and you bring them to your school, and you spray paint the numbers 1, 2, and 4 on the sides of it, and you release them in the school, so the teachers
Think there's a third one?
think there's 3. They're like, where's 3?
That's so funny.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Oh, that was one of
Here's a good high school
That's what
prank.
JTF2 is.
This is not about Syrian refugees or JTF2, but this is also a good high school prank that some people did at a neighboring high school of mine. Was they had their combo to their buddy's locker, so they opened it one day, stuffed it full of pornography to the point where they had to hold the door closed to closed it, and then went to the shop and got the welder and welded his lock shut so that when he got to school, he had to get the janitor to cut his lock off, and when the janitor cut it off, like, porn exploded all over the hallway.
That is a good one.
It's funny because it's like no one really gets hurt, but it's objectively hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
Syrian high
refugees.
school pranks, JTF2,
Yeah.
just going down.
I mean, yeah, I feel like we've covered the major bases. Oh, so in Canada, here's maybe like the last act of this explanation.
Yeah.
In Canada right now, the government will fund Syrian refugees for a year, and private sponsorship, your obligation is to fund them for a year. So there's a lot of talk now. There's a great series in the New York Times where they were talking about Canadian families taking in Syrian refugees, and the most recent one, and I think the final one in the series, they followed the same family for a number of years, is about month 13. It's about, like, are you self-sufficient after 12 months when the funding dries up? The answer is almost always no.
Right.
Again, we've talked about, like, these people, some of them are illiterate. It's super slow for them to learn English. Could you get a job? Like, if you had to move to Turkey and learn how to speak Arabic, would you be self-sufficient in a year? Like, it's not clear that you would be, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it's an unrealistic goal. I think that we just need to be okay with helping provide for these people's integration for a long-term situation. And I'm okay personally with that being almost indefinite.
Right.
Like, why not?
If
Hey,
we
how
had
about this?
universal
Why don't we
basic
get a
income,
fucking universal basic income and a fucking federal job guarantee, and then just put them in that system, so then we
Yeah.
all have it. Then we don't have to worry about resettling refugees anymore, do we? Right?
No.
If we just grab, if we take a portion of all capital gains in the country and use that to fund everybody's universal basic income, all of a sudden this refugee question gets a lot simpler.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that provides a framework for all of us moving forward, doesn't it? Anyway, there's a lot of ways forward. I think that we all have to become okay with the idea that these people need resources to be resettled, but they should be resettled. We have an obligation morally to resettle them, and we should get good at it, because guess what? It's going to be happening.
It's happening again, and it's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Google Robot Richard.
You're welcome, Jamie.
Wait, why haven't you been talking like that the
Your
whole time?
dildo pizza has arrived.
Oh.
Got you, asshole.
Oh, God damn it, Google Robot Richard.
Just kidding. I'm a human.
Or am I? I have been dreaming of electric sheep.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I got. Like,
Yeah, that's great. It's another puzzle piece on the great Middle Eastern topic. You know, of I'm sort of appreciating us handling these kinds of things this
piece
way.
by piece.
Piece by piece, because otherwise it's a lot to munch on.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it. I obviously had no idea about the Bangladeshi global warming issue.
It's like too under the radar. Like literally, because I remember I had heard anecdotally about it, and when I was researching this, I heard that thing about how all the people in Bangladesh might need to be resettled soon. I should Google that. And I Googled it, and it was like right there.
Yeah,
it's like, but I was like, oh shit. Like we need to all be talking about this a little bit more.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's harrowing.
Yeah, I recommend. There was an excellent article written in a newspaper from Belfast. It was one of basically the first things that arrived on Google when I typed in, "Is Bangladesh sinking?" into Google.
It was just Google wrote back, yes.
Yeah, it's a very long form piece. I'll put maybe a link to it in the episode description or something. It was really a good read, harrowing read. I recommend it. It was great. Great
Cool.
article. Should we do a little wrap up? What have we learned, Jamie?
Little rip rap. Civil war in Syria between Bashir al-Assad, the rebels, and ISIS is. It's got its.
Don't forget them Kurds.
Its sticky little fingers
Them
in there,
dope
as
Kurds.
well as the dope Kurds.
Yeah.
So there are 12 million Syrian refugees in need of a place to stay. Places like Germany is taking 1 million. It's really a very serious crisis in Europe, because there's no ocean. You just pour out of that country into another country. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of panic in and around that. The United States is taking 10,000. Canada's taking 40,000.
I should say, I never said this. Declaring yourself a refugee works both ways. So, like, once you declare yourself a refugee in a country, that country is obligated to provide for you under the Geneva Convention,
right,
which all these countries have agreed to. So, like, they get access to resources from the UN, but, like, once you're a refugee, you have to be cared for. You can't just be deported, like all kinds of stuff like that. Right?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Do you? And you obviously need papers and stuff like that to show where you're from.
No. Sometimes you don't have them.
Well,
Sometimes you don't have them.
Little, my little competitive life hacky brain. Why, if I was homeless, why wouldn't I just go to the guy, like, government, and say, go to the airport and say, I'm a refugee?
I mean, sometimes they do that.
Homeless people do.
Not homeless people, but like I've been on international flights before, where there's people there checking passports before you get to customs, so that you can't declare yourself a refugee.
Oh.
It's like, because I think I have to look into this. I think you can't just do it anywhere.
Right.
I think you need to do it at like a border point, or at a customs is like a place people do it, or stuff like that.
Right.
So I think there might be ways around that kind of thing. I mean,
I'm sure if you were a Canadian-born person, obviously looking to take advantage of a system, that they would find you out pretty quickly.
Yeah, and because they obviously then they maybe would declare you, they examine you, but obviously, like you personally, Jamie, speak only English with the Canadian accent, so that would probably be a point against you.
Right.
And then,
but I am illiterate in Arabic, so
yeah, getting declared a refugee is probably not a vast improvement to being homeless.
Right.
Also, you know, like you would have to apply for resettlement in Canada. Right. Like once you are a refugee, if you want to get resettled in Canada and get access, like I guess your hack is like, then the government will give me $27,000 to live for a year.
Yeah.
Right. But that takes years, and you get the shit vetted out of you.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so to continue on, 10,000 in the States, around 40,000 in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a massive issue, and also it's a real opportunity to show history what we've got, especially since there is a much worse issue coming down.
Show me what you've got.
Show me what you've got.
That's all I can think right now.
Show me what you've got.
I like what you've got is hopefully what
Get
they will be
swifty.
saying.
Get swifty.
Everyone who doesn't watch Rick and Morty who's listening to this podcast, I apologize for that.
Oh man, that's a good episode.
Go watch Rick and Morty.
I watched that episode literally today, actually.
That's so funny.
Show us what you've got.
The president in that episode is amazing. Like he's like, God damn it, I believe in him. This is a hot ass jam.
Yeah, he's like, but I do believe in them. And Get Swifty was a jam. Oh, so good.
Please go watch Rick and Morty. It's very funny.
This Bangladeshi thing, that's something I didn't know about. That's very, very troubling. And also, you know, sometimes here's perhaps a controversial, not necessarily point of view, but a thought, is that I was reading this article in which they were discussing time travel, and most people's answer to like what would you do if you could time travel is to go back in time and kill Hitler.
Seriously?
That's what a lot of people say. A lot of people are like, I would go back in time and kill Hitler. And the point of this article was like, okay, let's analyze what would happen if you actually did that. And like, you know, there's certain a whole lot of theorizing, you know, and a whole lot of just suspension of disbelief. But the point of the article was, you know, you think about all the good things that have happened in the world because of the point of reference that Hitler and Nazi Germany created.
Right.
And like, you know, they created like this benchmark of evil.
Right.
And benchmark of what we don't want to be in. Much in when we were talking about Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
You know, Germany has defined itself in this century, in the later part of the 20th century, by being not what they were in the early part of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Anyway, bring that back of like, I sort of look at this imminent Bangladeshi refugee crisis, obviously with horror and like, I can't believe global warming is already at that point.
Yep.
But, you know, part of me is like, maybe that is the catalyst, that maybe that is the moment that we all need to happen. Not for millions of people to die. I don't mean to say that, but maybe we need 150 million people to be like, you all fucked up.
You need to. I mean, like this
now let's fix it.
This is such an imperfect metaphor, and I hate myself for doing it. But it's like the Reichstag, right? Like the burning of the Reichstag. That was what, or the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You know, it's like you need a big visible tragedy in order to galvanize public sympathy. Now, I mean, I'm saying, and I honestly hope, we don't need all the people to drown and die in order for us to get moving on this. We need to look at it and go, holy shit, this is for real.
Yeah.
And even if, I mean, like, let's start acting. Let's start making this happen now.
Right. So it's not a surprise.
So that we're sort of ready. Yeah, exactly. I understand. Okay, now it's real. I think that's a real thing psychologically that people do. I really don't want all those people to die for our own, like, you know, benefit. For our own, like, oh shit, this is for real benefit. I think that we should get our shit together and just help them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you know, it's that old, like, and this is a real folksy Alberta thing, but you know, you fall down on your skates and you get back up and you're better than you were before you fell.
Right.
You know, of like, yeah, or as I love Sam Harris, as he said, there are exponentially more ways to fail in every situation than there are to succeed, and so the odds of failing are higher than success, and so that's we're just constantly failing until we succeed. And like it's this is a glib way to talk about 150 million people losing the country that they live in,
Yeah.
But I don't know because there's all this global warming science, and
Yeah.
and
people
all
seem
this
to find some fucking way to ignore that.
yeah, and they find their way to. So I'm like, what is it going to take? What is the line in the sand?
We have to admit to ourselves that we are living a life of comfort and luxury that we are unwilling to part with, but that it is, this is the word. It's unsustainable.
Yeah.
Our lifestyle in the West. The nice things we have, the clothes we have, the food that we get, this shit is not a sustainable way to live, and we are killing the planet, and very quickly we'll be killing hundreds of millions of other people in order to continue living like this. I heard, this is not my metaphor, this comes broken telephone third hand to me from somebody who was watching this lecture series in Canada called the Massey Lectures. I don't know anything about them. I don't remember. It was a woman giving this lecture because the current topic is the Syrian refugee crisis of the Massey Lectures. I don't remember the woman who made the metaphor. I apologize. But the metaphor has stuck with me, and she said, relayed to me by a person who had listened to it, the moment that the West is facing right now is you are walking through a park wearing a brand new bespoke tailored suit and brand new sneakers, and you see a child drowning in a pond.
Right.
Do you jump in and ruin your suit and sneakers to save that child's life? That's the moment we're in.
Right. Interesting.
Is our comfort and luxury worth those people's lives?
Yeah.
Because the honest truth is that in order to provide for this huge movement of people that is definitely going to happen in the next 100 years, our lifestyles will have to change. They'll just have to change.
Right.
We can't keep doing the stuff that we've been doing. I don't think that's a bad thing. We live in an artificial illusion of abundance in the West, but our abundance comes at the cost of the health and safety of poor people all over the world who are invisible to us.
Right. Wow.
Anyway.
I would take off my suit and sneakers.
As would I.
Yeah.
In fact, let's take our clothes off right now, Jamie.
Oh my God! He's just got a circuit board where his nipples should be.
It's happening.
He's a Google machine. Now I am here. Google Jamie lives.
Come, Google Jamie. Let us make a hot-ass playlist of jams.
Yes, and we will charge people $5 a month to listen to said playlist.
That's right. This is the end game for humanity, ladies and gentlemen.
Show us what you got. Get swifty.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, that's been our episode for this week.
Okay.
If you like what you've been hearing, please take a listen to our older episodes if you haven't. We have a new episode every week on a complicated political topic, as well as most weeks a second bonus episode, which has a fun extra little dollop of content.
That's right.
And if you have an idea for a topic you want us to explain, if you heard things in this episode that you felt we didn't explain correctly, or you have more questions about things we did explain, please send us an email, explaintojamie@gmail.com. Tweet at us, at explainjamie, or find us on SoundCloud. Leave us a comment, soundcloud.com/explaintojamie.
The Facebook page.
We have a Facebook page.
Obviously. If you type "explain it to Jamie" into Google will...
Jamie and I personally, as the physical manifestations of Google, will take you there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, feel safe.
Someone just typed it in right now.
Hey.
Also, somebody wants to see pictures of boobs.
Yep, that's all I get
all
humanity.
day.
That's beautiful. I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
This is Explain It to Jamie. Like, share, subscribe. Be cool!